Thank you, Nancy. As you may have noticed, our theme today is this passage in Mark 8, verse 27 to 38. And if you're looking for a title for this message, I titled it Perception Matters. And in reality, I actually attempted to use a double word play here when I chose this title, because you see, this passage does point out matters of perception, and at the same time it also points out that perception matters. So I attempted to shoot two birds in one bullet, so to speak. And so you said perception matters, which means it's pointing out matters about perception, and perception matters. See, because perception does matter. Perception in our world today of information age, we do have a lot of ideas and concepts out there in the world, and by our observation, we bring these ideas into our mind, and we formulate a mental picture, a mental image, which we call cognizance, or understanding, or perception. And perception is important. Perception matters. It reminds me of a story just to illustrate. Here was this man who had an illness, see, and he consulted several doctors, and the prognosis was that he only had 6 months to live. So this guy's a fighter, and he didn't want to give up. So he sought out the most prestigious doctor out there, and he went to him, and this doctor, he examined his records. And so he asked him, do you eat fatty foods, those delicious foods? And he said, yeah, I love them. I mean, I only have 6 months to live. I better enjoy. And he said, well, you better cut it out. From now on, you just eat vegetables without salt, because that's wrong for you, bad for you. And then he asked further, said, what about wine? Do you eat wine with your dinner? And said, yeah, I mean, it makes me enjoy dinner more. And said, cut that out as well. From now on, you just drink water, plain water, because all that wine is bad for you. And then he said, what about coffee? Can I drink coffee? He said, no, cut that out as well. Just plain water from now on. And then the doctor said, do you party a lot? And he said, of course, you got to enjoy life. And the doctor said, cut that out as well. Because, in parties, they offer sweet drinks and sweets. It's not good for you. Cut that out. And then he said, what about the TV? Do you watch television? Do you watch entertainment? And he said, yeah, you need to enjoy yourself. And the doctor said, cut that out as well. Because, once you start TV, you could stay there all night, and you need sleep. Lack of sleep is not good for you. So now this guy is just getting discouraged. And he said, well, doctor, if I did all these things, how long will I live? And the doctor said, well, you'll live 6 months. I said, what? You have the same prognosis as the other doctors. And this prestigious doctor said, yes, but if you diligently do everything that I tell you to do, those 6 months would seem like way much longer. See, perception matters. Perception does matter. And that's why I believe the gospel brings out here an episode where Jesus Christ asks this matter of perception here. We go here in Mark 8, verse 27. And it says here, and Jesus went out along with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he questioned his disciples, saying to them, who do people say that I am? Basically he's saying, how do people perceive me? And verse 28, the disciples said, well, they're saying that you're John the Baptist. Others say you're Elijah. And others say you're just one of the prophets. See, all those different perceptions of Jesus Christ at that time already. They're saying, you're just John the Baptist, you're just Elijah, or you're just one of the prophets. And if you really look at it, it's the same way today. You could go out there and ask who Jesus Christ is, and there are so many perceptions about him. Many, in fact, just see him as another one of the good teachers that you can follow. Yeah. And so there are so many perceptions about Jesus today, just like in the time, at the time when Jesus asked this question of his disciples, what do people think he was? What was their perception of him? And so in verse 29, like Pastor Bordnox already mentioned, this is the main important question for us. And then he continued in verse 29 by questioning them, said, but who do you say I am? That is a very important question. Jesus is asking, what is your perception of me? What is your perception of me? And of course, Peter answered, because how in a group, it seems to be like automatically one stands out as a spokesperson for the group. So basically Peter's answer is like the answer for the whole group. And Peter answered in verse 29 and said to him, thou art the Christ, or that's the NAS version, or you are the Messiah. Peter said, you are the Messiah. And to get a better picture of this, if you go to Matthew 16, verse 17 to 19, Matthew 16, verse 17 to 19, as soon as Peter answered, you are the Messiah, what did Jesus tell him? In Matthew 16, verse 17 to 19, verse 17 says, and Jesus answered and said to him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I say to you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not overpower it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Can you imagine this? Something is revealed here. When Peter said, you are the Christ, Jesus reveals that the matter of knowing Jesus as the Messiah also comes from God. We cannot find out about this on our own, even though nowadays you can see posters where it says, look, I found Jesus, or, it's the other way around. It is God who reveals that Jesus is the Messiah. And I think we should be all thankful here that we understand and we perceive Jesus Christ as the Messiah. That's been a blessing to us. God revealed it to us through his word, and and his word processed through our minds. And in our minds, this mental image has been created, which gave us the cognizance, the understanding that Jesus is the Messiah. It comes from God. And of course, we go back again to Mark 8, verse 30. And he warned them to tell no one about him, because, at that time, Jesus knew that they still did not understand. They were not fully equipped to bring out this message. So he said, don't tell anyone about him being the Messiah. And then the interesting part here is verse 31. Here then, Jesus continues in Mark 8, verse 31. He continues, and he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. This time in verse 32, he was just telling them the matter plainly. He did not use parables. He just told it to them plainly. And what happens here in verse 32? Peter took him aside and he began to rebuke Jesus Christ. Could you imagine that? Just a few verses back, he declares that Jesus is the Messiah. And then now here in verse 32, he begins to rebuke Jesus Christ. Can you see how perception changes? It changed. Now, why do you think Peter rebuked Jesus? Well, you see, the perception of Messiah for the Jews is, let me see, I got this from the Jewish Virtual Library. You can see this on the web. And it shows a Jewish tradition of the perspective of Messiah. This is how the Jews perceive what the Messiah is supposed to be. And it's basically, there are at least like 5 things about the Messiah from a Jewish perspective. One is that he will be a descendant of King David, right? And Jesus was a descendant of King David. The second one is that he will gain sovereignty over the land of Israel. He will, in other words, he's going to be the king over the land of Israel. And then the third is that he will gather the Jews back to the land of Israel from the 4 corners of the earth. And then the fourth is that he will restore to Israel the full observance of the Torah law. See? And then the fifth one, the grand finale, is that he will bring peace to the entire world. That is the Jewish perspective of the Messiah. He will be a descendant of King David. He will be a king over the land of Israel. He will gather all the Jews back to the land of Israel from all the 4 corners of the world, and he will restore them to full observance of Torah law. And then, in the grand finale of all things, he will bring peace to the whole world. See? And even then, in this perspective, there are still other things that they kind of debate about. And this is concerning the prophecies of Isaiah about the grand finale when he will bring peace to the whole world. One particular one is that Isaiah chapter 11, verse 6, wherein it says, the lion will will dwell with the lamb, and the wolf will dwell with sleep with the lamb, all that. And yeah, the wolf shall dwell with the lamb, and the calf with the young lion, right? And so there's several perspectives on this. Like the Middle Ages Jewish scholar Maimonides, he was a Jewish rabbi, an astronomer, he was a philosopher and a physician at the same time. He was the most renowned Jewish philosopher at that age, you know, in the mid 1100s to the early 1200s. His perspective of this passage of Isaiah, where the wolf shall dwell with the lamb and the calf with a young lion, he says that it's only a metaphor. See, and he believes that Isaiah's language is just a metaphor, and the wolf stands for the enemies of the Jews. And so in the new age, the enemies of the Jews, which are the wolves, will no longer threaten them. So it's just a metaphor. That's a perspective. That's a perception. However, a century later, another Jewish rabbi, another philosopher, and also a physician, which is, his name is Nachmanides, he rejected Maimonides' interpretation, wherein he said it's a metaphor. Nachmanides said, no, it's literal. You know, it's in the coming age, the animals will all be tamed, and they will be able to be domesticated, and then they will be sweet-tempered, so that the lion will, and the lamb and the calf, they will all dwell together in harmony. See, that's another perspective. That's another perception. And then we come to a later, more recent times. We also have another Jewish actor, comedian named Woody Allen. You probably know him, right? His interpretation is said that the lamb and the wolf shall indeed lie together, but the lamb won't get any sleep. See? Different perceptions. Different perceptions. But if you notice, in the Jewish perception of the Messiah, they left something out in their observation. Remember, perception comes from observing all of these different ideas. And by your observation, it brings it into your mind, and you formulate a mental image called cognizance, which is perception. The thing that they left out here is the prophecy of Isaiah in chapter 53. It's not here in their perception of the Messiah. They did not include this in their observation under the context of Messiah. This is Isaiah chapter 53, which is talking about the suffering servant. See how it is important what we observe and what we take in, because it will mold our perception. And so here was Peter's perception of a Messiah. He's going to be a descendant of King David. Oh yes, check mark for Jesus Christ. He's going to be a king, check. That's Jesus Christ. And they were expecting him to gather all Israel from all the four corners of the earth. And they were expecting him to bring the full observance of Torah law. They were expecting him to be that king, you know, right then and there. It's near. But then when Jesus Christ started talking about, you know, where is it? Verse 31, where he must suffer many things and be rejected of the elders and the chief priests. These are the religious leaders. and the scribes, and and Jesus was talking about being killed. Here was Peter, hey, he was probably saying, hey, boss, you better slow down here. You better retract what you're saying. You're kind of losing credibility here. You're not meeting my perception of the Messiah. And so in verse 32, he began to rebuke him. Peter began to rebuke Jesus Christ, right? In Mark 8, verse 32. And so what happens in verse 33? This was Jesus now saying, but turning around and seeing his disciples, Jesus rebuked Peter and said, "Get thee behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on God's interests, but man's." This was the sternest utterance of rebuke in Jesus Christ's earthly ministry. Could you imagine that? Just a few verses back, he said, "Blessed are you, Peter." And then now in verse 33, he said, "Get behind me, Satan." The very same Peter. Wow, perception matters. Because here, what Peter did is it has a resemblance, it's similar to what Satan did in the great temptation in the wilderness. Remember Matthew chapter 4, verse 8 to 9, wherein Satan, took Jesus Christ up on a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. Matthew 4, verse 8 to 9. And then Satan said to him, "All these things I will give you now, here and then, if you fall down and worship me." What Satan is basically saying is, you can bypass the crucifixion. You don't have to suffer. I will give you the kingdom right now, here and then, if you fall down and worship me. See? Satan was offering Jesus Christ that he can bypass the sufferings. He can bypass crucifixion. And here, Peter, in Mark 8, verse 32, he was basically saying the same thing. Lord, don't talk about suffering. Don't talk about being killed. I'm going to protect you. See? And Peter was sincere in his stating that, but he was not aware that in doing so, he was being influenced once again by Satan with the same kind of motive. Hey, Lord, bypass the crucifixion. Just take over the kingdom right now. I am going to protect you. Don't say that you will suffer. See? He allowed Satan to deceive him. That's why Jesus Christ said, "Get thee behind me, Satan. You are influencing one of my disciples." So it shows that we have to be very careful of what we bring in. What we bring in. Perception matters. What did he say? Verse 33, "You are not setting your mind on God's interests, but man's." So that shows us something, that we should always strive to be in tune with God's interests. We should always prayerfully ask for empowerment so that we will be in tune to God's interest, so that our perception will be the right perception. And so here again in verse 34, now Jesus points out the proper perception of what a believer is supposed to be. Verse 34. And now he summoned not only his disciples, but also everyone, the multitudes, right? He summoned the multitudes with his disciples and said to them, if anyone wishes to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. Wow, do we get what Jesus Christ is saying? You know, it's so easy, it seems, from my observation, that it seems like the prevailing thought or perception is that, you know, all we need to do is answer an altar call and say we give our heart to the Lord, and be remorseful about it, and then, you know, that's that. We are born again and we got it made. That's it. And that kind of thought again reminded me of another story. You know, it's like, I see I'm on the roll now. I'm just going to give stories and anecdotes. There were like three friends. These were all ministers, right? And they were sitting together. They were having coffee in Starbucks, you know, and they were discussing an issue about the problem of mice in their house of worship. You know, you had this Catholic priest and this evangelical pastor and this Jewish rabbi. They were all having coffee together, and the Catholic priest said, you know, we have a problem in our church, this mice, and so we had them fumigated, and that didn't help, because a month later they all came back. And now the evangelical pastor said, you know, we have the same problem. And what we did was we painstakingly relocated all these mice to a very far field. But that didn't work either, you know, because after a week, they all came back. And then the Jewish pastor, the Jewish rabbi said, you know what? We also had that problem with mice. And then one day we had an advisory council meeting, and we invited all the mice. And then we voted upon it, and we made them official members of the congregation. The following Sabbath, none of the mice showed up. In fact, the entire year, they don't show up except during Yom Kippur and Hanukkah. You know, it's kind of a funny story, but it has the ring of reality to it, wherein, you know, people get baptized, and so they're all excited at first, and then pretty soon things come up in the world where after a while you don't see them anymore attending church services except Easter or Christmas. Easter or Christmas. But here Jesus Christ reveals what it is to become a disciple of Jesus Christ. And he says, if you wish to follow me, you should deny yourself. Take up this cross and follow me. Wow. Deny yourself. deny yourself. And he continues on in verse 25. Whoever wishes to save his life shall lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel shall save it. See? And the word life here in verse 35, who wishes to save his life, the word life is the Greek word psuche, P-S-U-C-H-E. Some use the Greek word psyche, which is basically the personality, the entire person, which includes all of one's dreams, hopes, and goals, all of one's desire in this life. That's the life that Jesus Christ is referring to. Are we willing? You know, he actually is presenting a paradox here. You know, a paradox is it seems like a contradictory statement, but there is a deep meaning to it. It says, whoever wishes to save his life shall lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's sake will save it. You know, if you lose or you relinquish your hopes and your personal hopes and dreams and goals and say, Lord, I give it all up for you so that you can take over my life. He's saying by doing that, you will find your life. Now, how is that even possible? Well, what you're basically saying is, Lord, I surrender my will to your will. And if you really analyze it, what is God's will? Didn't he reveal it in Jeremiah? You know, my will for you is to prosper you, is to give you joy, is to make you better. So in a way, if we give up our own personal hopes and dreams and goals and say, Lord, I want your goals and your will for me to take over me, then you basically made God's will your own, which is going to last forever, which is way better than our own personal goals and dreams and hopes, because our own personal dreams and goals and hopes has an end. If we exchange that for God's will and hope for us. And I covered this in my last message, right? God is good all the time. So if we have God's will with us, we have gained way, way much more. In verse 36, again in Matthew 8, verse 36, in 37, he basically asks a rhetorical question. He says, for what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul? Here again is that same word, soul, psuche, P-S-U-C-H-E, which is translated life here in verse 35, which is a person's whole personality, his life's dreams and hopes and goals. What shall a man give in exchange for his soul? This is a rhetorical question that Jesus asks, which is basically nothing. It's impossible. No one can. There's nothing that a man can give. Only God can give. Only God can give the most ideal hope and dreams and goals in life. And so he goes on to verse 38, for whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will also be ashamed of him when he comes in the glory of his Father with his holy angels. You see, a man can be so brave that he can literally face lions and not be afraid, or the fiercest enemy in war and will not be afraid, but to face man's rigid ridicule for being like a Jesus freak, ooh, that is hard to face. It's tougher to face. You know, Proverbs 29, verse 25 says, the fear of man brings a snare. See, we're so worried about the opinion of men. And that's probably why, and I include myself here, we are so reluctant to talk about Jesus Christ. You know, and when people are all gathered and there is a big potential of you being ridiculed, more likely we are not going to talk about Jesus Christ. But of course, we have to be wise as well. We also have to remember what Jesus said, do not cast the pearl into swine. But that's, I think, a very rare occasion. I think the opportunity is there to mention Jesus Christ and make them aware so that they will have that information, so that they can process it, so that their perception changes. So that we should not be ashamed of Jesus. We should not be ashamed of Jesus. And so this passage here that we covered today points out the importance of proper perception of who is Jesus as the Messiah and who we are as disciples. You know, it's not just a matter of, wow, Jesus died on the cross and saved me. Yes, that's true. But Jesus, the Messiah, is also Lord and King that needs to be adored and not just admired. And also, being a disciple is not just a matter of saying, Lord, I accept you in my heart, and leave it at that. Jesus said, if you wish to come and follow me, you deny yourself and take up the cross. Wow, if you're one of the Jews before, take up the cross is such a different perspective, a different perception, because they see people being crucified wherein they carry the crossbeam on the way to their crucifixion. That means you have to be ready to be humiliated. I don't think we even take those questions seriously. Do we even ask those questions of us? If there comes a time where we have to be ridiculed and maybe even persecuted and maybe even asked to give up our lives, are we ready? We all claim to be disciples of Jesus Christ. And so I hope this passage, covering this passage once again, will give us the proper perspective of who Jesus Christ as the Messiah is and who we are as the disciples of Jesus Christ, because this proper perspective does matter. Amen.